Hello everyone, today we read the third paragraph of the third chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz Vom Kriege, its title being War is part of the intercourse of the human race. The text follows. We say therefore, war belongs not to the province of arts and sciences, but to the province of social life. It is a conflict of great interests which is settled by bloodshed, and only in that is different from others. It would be better, instead of comparing it with any art, to liken it to business competition, which is also a conflict of human interests and activities. And it is still more like state policy, which again, on its part, may be looked upon as a kind of business competition on a great scale. Besides, state policy is the womb in which war is developed, in which its outlines lie hidden in a rudimentary state, like the qualities of living creatures in their germs. This is a very beautiful paragraph that von Clausewitz comes up with, apparently without following a logical step here from what we have read before, meaning that in the previous paragraph he has stressed objectively how war is nor an art nor a science proper. It's kind of closer to the art, but it can't be considered as, it can't fit in one of the two. There is we have seen how he got here, passing through, the formulation of the reasons why we can't formulate and how also formulate a theory of the art of war. But literally these statements here are fully coherent with the world picture that we have come to delineate now up to now. And von Clausewitz, in a certain sense, makes us returning back with this paragraph on a very concrete, very material, very everyday life, you could argue, dimension, right? And it has this beautiful, potent phrases. Look at the title here. War is part of the intercourse of the human race, right? So this statement is really heavy if you realize what it means. As basically, von Clausewitz is telling us that war is a normal business, literally business as we will see now, in the way we relate to each other, right? And there are massive here philosophical, not much implications, because he has explained us why this is the case. So he has began straight out of nowhere. He has built the narration step by step, holding our hands while we were reading. Like, so he stopped. He explained better. He precised a lot of things. And yet he comes out with this idea that we've met chiefly at the beginning of the work, where it was demonstrated on a physical base, for which we can't do without violence. Here, war is naturally something a bit more complicated when it gets to its political and social organization, but here we're talking fundamentally, von Clausewitz is talking about fundamentally violence as such. And we have to acknowledge this. We are constantly violent. We do behave violently. Every word is violence, for real, right? This is nothing to do with as a politically colored statement. This is literally what it is. I mean, whatever you do in any form to anyone is containing a part of violence, right? And we live with that because we have always done it. And there is actually nothing wrong, because violence can be positive, right? There is a part of rationality that entails violence, right? It's the same concept that we have stressed over and over again, reading the Vom Kriege, that you can't be emotional while you're dispensing violence. I mean, you're gonna be, right? You can't be fully rational, but that's exactly the point, that ethically speaking, we are challenged to use the means at our disposals in a way that it actually fits the purpose. Von Clausewitz never tells what's the deal, like why we should do it or not do it, right? That is up to us, because the range of reasons motives that we have to act in the first place are known only by us, and nobody can foresee that, by the way. That is also very important. It does fit the Clausewitzian theory also in here among the things we do not know about the world we live in. We're not fully, not even in our own head. We actually understand everything cent for cent, but still, that's the point. We do constantly act violently, and we constantly affirm ourselves violently, and we couldn't do without that. I mean, without violence, there is no civilization, there is no intelligence, there is no rationality. You can argue that our civilization emerged from the need of giving order to our instinct, and that's the point. And the statement that war is nothing but the continuation of policy by other means is exactly accepting the fact that we can be more or less violent, even if we don't want to be philosophically, so pedant. We can't say that war naturally is never what must happen. Is actually something we do pretty rarely, considering the range of options we constantly have at our disposal, and we have good reason for doing that. It's always about the reason, it's always about the motivation. But objectively, we have to acknowledge that everything we have done to improve our life did pass through the desperation of dealing with a world that is ferociously competitive. I mean, this is at the base of every contractualist view. I mean, think about the theory of homo homini lupus, or that is exaggerated, because we know, in fact, biologically, evolutionarily speaking, that there's never been a moment in human history proper, but not in animal history in this regard, in which we were one against the other by default. We came out of nature already socially oriented, right? Look at every primate aside from us in general, but also other animals. It's not that animals are just a bunch of bloodthirsty monsters that want to eat each other, constantly practicing cannibalism, right? It's not the case, right? But we have to acknowledge that indeed the effort that we made to build up things like science, like rationality, like the things that improved materially our lifestyle every day up to now are, in a certain sense, a patch. I know it's kind of depressing to put it in this terms, but it's literally a patch to this kind of unruly nature of ours that is definitely fueled by enmity, by this instinctive, turbulent emotions, etc. That can be, also be love, but it can also be hate. It can be, in fact, the most destructive instincts that we can have. And the problem we have in our society, as we also always say, is that we think that war in it, we make this asinine mistake of considering war and violence in itself as a, politically colored or culturally colored thing. While we don't acknowledge that violence is not only of great use, in fact, for our development, and it can help us to do a great deal of very positive things, including defending ourselves, but also preventing other people from being hurt. And you deny the value of resistance if you deny the value of violence. We should learn to respect violence. And the paradox is that exactly deeming war to be constitutively negative, wrong, morally speaking, is a denial of human goodness and morality, because it takes away an option that we may be forced to use at some point. This is actually what von Clausewitz writes the Vom Kriege for, meaning that he, as we were saying before, he never actually expresses a reason for which to fight. That is your business. It will always be entirely yours, right, or of your society in general, whoever wages the violence on a large scale for whichever purpose. But he actually says, even if you must be aware of the fact that you could end up into this, and by explaining to us, even if you don't like it, by explaining to us how this works, he makes us observe that not only we are constantly under violence of some form, but that we also exercise violence constantly, right? And this is a normal dialectic of the human race, and that's the point. And this is valid for everybody, right? There is not a there is not a culture in the sense that is more or less violent than others because it's automatically more or less good than or evil, conversely, in a proportionate way, right? There is always a proportion between what you do, and there is it's a matter of purpose, of meaning, right? That's why I always make the example of resistance, because we realize in our world what the value of that exertion of violence has been for our freedom, for our democracy, for our well-being, and how we rightfully treasure it, right? Resistance broadly meant as any form of unjust imposition. A contrast to an unjust imposition. And naturally, even behind that, there is a great debate, because there are a lot of people who say simply, I don't care, I shouldn't kill anyone because I believe that. So even if that means to save other, 10 people, I don't do it because I refuse that. Well, whichever your reasons may be, but you always have to acknowledge that maybe other 10 people died because you refused to use violence yourself. So there are many examples you can make in this sense, but by this time, especially if you have followed this series, you know what we're talking about this all the time. So we don't need to insist. But it's important here that von Clausewitz stresses the humanity of war, which is something you never hear. War is inhuman to many. And this is a gross mistake, because if there is something that is truly human, it's war, right? In the way it's actually performed. Don't look at violence in itself, right? Violence, yes, does belong also to other animals that also organize themselves to fight against each other. That's not quite war. War is another thing. And it does pertain to the human race. This is the point. Human race of every type, because we are all humans the same way, is a violent race. Humanity is a violent race. Humans are violent, by definition. So, addressing the text, von Clausewitz says, we say therefore war belongs not to the province of arts and sciences, but to the province of social life. This is a beautiful statement that highlights, in fact, the internal, the social dialectic where violence effectively dwells, right? War properly does not belong to an art or science, because it's not something that can be abstracted from the political and social dimension. It's not something you can confine. An art can be taught by someone who knows that. Other people would be unaware of that. Science is can be done too. And even if it was an absolute, like in our physical world, right, as a notion, we still, can live personally without actually hearing. How many people live without knowing what quantum mechanics is? Well, they're perfectly fine. Well, but war cannot be excluded ever from the province of social life, right? You can't think of a world that, even if we lived in a world that was completely pacified, which also we would at that point have to determine what it means, right? What is peace actually, right? Here we should also distinguish between things like conflict and war, for example. But let's assume, in fact, there was a world without war. Well, the Clausewitzian theory, which is backed by basically every evidence that we have in science for the last 200 years, from when von Clausewitz was writing this piece, is that, you can create a world in which, ideally, there's no war, right? It's possible. At one point, there would be an effective mean and authority and set of circumstances, of interests, of ideas or beliefs that will render war, that would make war disappear. But the point here is that it doesn't correspond to any stage of civilization per se, but to the human nature proper, which means that potentially were those conditions to come less, right, we would revert unavoidably to war, right? So actually, to put it in a, unless we modified ourselves genetically in some way to kind of dilute this this violence of ours. But even in that, it's really a challenge, because if you look at how other living beings actually cooperate, well, they with especially a certain level of development, violence is innate as well, right? Animals are violent by themselves. I mean, even those who, it has nothing to do with whether they actually kill each other. I mean, we're talking here about the mere action and what that means and how it impacts others, right? You could be violent in the sense that you accidentally commit an act that damages someone else, and that person is going to be mad at you and is going to hate you and is potentially turning his potential violence towards you as a name, right? So this happens all the time, and this can be easily observable in many circumstances. Look at when disasters happen. Not necessarily talking about today, but think about those who go robbing other people's houses when there are hurricanes, floods, and stuff like that. Well, that's a pretty violent character of humans that were political and social ties of a certain fashion disappear, that they revert back to this what would define to serve improperly as an animal state, like state, let's say. But that's exactly who we are all the time. And what we also fail to acknowledge, and I think that there is a disturbing coincidence between those people who actually deny the violence of human nature and the same violence that such statements contain potentially in the way they're expressed. The fact that we can turn into killers basically in less than 3 seconds, no matter who we are, right? We can, under given circumstances, to transform ourselves into killers in 3 seconds. Point. And that's not something it's not a trigger you can control, because it's written in your genes. You can be disciplined as much as you want, as much as you like, but we know it won't happen. Even the best trained special operators, whichever corps you want to think at, whichever special unit you want to think at, well, under certain specific circumstances, no matter how much they're trained and experienced and cold-blooded, they will start basically using their assault rifles as clubs, as if they were primitive apes, right? Because that's basically what we are. And you will lose the plot at one point, and you will be in the condition at one point you have to give up to the reality that the Latins said mors tua vita mea, right? That is pretty meaningful in here, and it's a bit, sadly, at the base of, it's a bit more evil than the evolutionary concept, because the evolutionary concept is a bit more egalitarian, right? You can die indifferently. There's no necessary relation between someone's life and your someone's death and your life, right? It could be a well that you die all, but that's the idea, is that humans can turn to be that evil, in fact, pretty easily. Evil in the sense that as a moral construct we think ourselves to be that evil, but this is something that you can easily see in many interviews, for example, many experiences. I say interviews because they are freely watchable, of veterans, quite actually good people in peacetime, that went through things in war that are undescribable, and that people are shocked by, and for which these people were also judged by sometimes, because they said, we wouldn't think we would arrive to do certain things, but we did, right? Because, and believe me, if you had been there, they said, you would have done the same thing too. Which doesn't mean it's automatically, this is not to justify certain crimes of war or things, but it's to say that under specific circumstances, the truest nature of mankind can turn to do quite terrible things. And sometimes you don't have an option but to be killed, right? And there is also, in fact, in this sense, a value even in passive resistance, etc. But if you had been passively resistant in, I don't know, World War II, quite likely today we would all live in a world of Nazis, and there were people who were passively resistant at that point, and let me tell you, it didn't go well for them. But and I say this for one specific reason, because sometimes we think that it's the thought, that it's the idea and the ideal that makes things change. Well, of course, the clash between moral forces is definitely the single most important thing that von Clausewitz identifies as well, but that has nothing to do to the way you're going effectively to take action or not. You can be inspired morally, but still not having the means or even the guts, because that is also, the motivations are different from actual moral resources sometimes, and they don't necessarily go together, and therefore you can't change everything with your mind. Another great lie that our generations have been taught is that we always have to respond kind of gently to what to abuses, to to injustice. Well, I don't think so, and I don't think that history actually shows that this is the case, that there is a greater success in a culture that was tolerant towards injustice than one that actually took quite serious measures to counter that. So these are very interesting topics, as you understand, that could open to many other digressions, but is to say that never take out of the equation violence, not because there is the risk that you're not going to use it, but exactly because we know that you're going to use it anyway in some form, that at least if you are from the right side, let's say, of history, let's put it in this way, you should know how to use violence, because it is difficult to use violence, and this is why von Clausewitz wrote an entire book to explain how this at least happens, what are the things that you should be prepared to and for in an active sense, right? So violence is, in this sense, not an option, right? It could sound strange, because objectively, declaring war or not is an option, but the concept is deeper, because enmity is not an option, because this inherent conflictuality and this potential violence that is always there in trigger, as we'll see now, is popping out at one point, and under certain circumstances that are maybe the ones you have to work on not to make it happen, which is what diplomacy does, right? But that is not. This is the most important thing. We're not here to work as a civilization to create an antidote to violence. We are here as a civilization to cooperate, that is, to orientate our moral forces to a peaceful intent. Peaceful, never pacifist, because pacifist, believe me, is one of the most radically brutal, violent, and unjust theories that have ever been formulated. We have to be peaceful, not pacifist. Believe me, there is an insane criminality in the concept of pacifism for the above mentioned reasons, as much as there is in militarism, right? Actually, the two things do not exist one without the other. So always know that violence is there, that it's as if you had a gun in your closet, right? And it's loaded, and it's there, and there may be, unfortunately, reasons that will make you use it at one point. Now, the big thing von Clausewitz is saying here from an ethical point of view is that there is no easy way out of that. Like, using the gun at that point is an enormous problem, but it shouldn't be in the measure in which the mean that you're employing, in fact, is proportionate to the whatever you are into trying to deal with at that point. That's the real thing. What do you do against a terrorist that is slaughtering innocent civilians? You shoot him down. Who cares if he dies, right? It's good and just to kill that person, and that's what we do as a civilized world. and that's exactly the same idea here that is portrayed. But we shouldn't apologize for it. We should reflect on it, which is two different things. I don't have to justify. I should be already educated at one point for which I know essentially what is my duty and what is not. And here there are deep philosophical implications behind it in political theory, etc. Because there is an enormous debate where we think about the one about death penalty, about torture, right? These are big problems, serious problems that do influence widely our world, right? The Western world itself is still pretty diverse in the way we approach such themes. We have quite different ideas, but at least we live in a world that is substantially democratic, where our human rights are respected, where we have a cultural awareness about the same reason that lays behind those rights, ancient philosophical traditions, common experiences about some of the most atrocious things that happened. In fact, if not all the most atrocious things that happened throughout all humanity, that for which learning history is mandatory in order to have a democratic education in the first place. But again, there are many different situations that can vary, while the one that as humans we are inherently violent cannot change. There is no way out of that. Humans cannot avoid to have violence in potential within themselves. It's not a matter of whether how that person is educated, where it comes from, what kind of experiences it had. We are all designed at a certain point to break and to be violent. It depends on why this happens, right? And it's a matter of social life. It's the core of the concept here is that it's something that is presented in every single social relation that we have, in a way or in another. And we know it. It's just behavioral, right? There are people who are more compliant, others that are more self-assertive. There's always a balance, by the way, between these two things. And it's also an evolutionary thing. I mean, we have been designed like that because we know that a certain part of society has to be in one way and another. And it seems that this balance, the challenge that is posed by it is also what actually developed civilization. Because if we had just been a mass of brutes who wanted to kill each other, there would be no human civilization at this point. And instead, this happened exactly because we had the means to counter violence with other violence, and therefore create a compromise that evidently was a more satisfactory deal than killing each other. That's also why war is so dramatically important for human civilization and stemmed so much from it. The science benefited enormously from war. Our achievements, improvements in human life did pass through things that potentially could wipe us out, but that also as a spin-off produced an enormous amount of what we thankfully have, right? And that we always have to think was earned in blood. We're not just on the intellectual shoulders of who came before us, right? Science is not just a matter of a single genius who came up with a physical law that we have to revere, because that genius was the product of a civilization that worked, that fought, that suffered, right? And therefore we come after them and with the legacy of them, and we should always remember that we cannot give things, for example, like freedom for granted, because millions of people died to ensure us that freedom. And we can, the moment we forget that, we're more likely to, in fact, not knowing what's this thing on the market, how much it's valued, right? Because freedom does have a price, sadly enough. So that's why it's not to be given for granted. Nor is life, indeed. That's what makes war also so challenging, and it has always been so. Never think that war is, animal-likely kind of erupting for no reason. This is also what von Clausewitz teaches with a massive dimensional attention towards the phenomenon. War doesn't break out because there is one single crazy guy that decides that. You need the overwhelming push from the society that for more than itself actually decides to back that single crazy guy, which is an entirely different thing. I say this because there are countries that, for example, are obsessed a little bit with more the idealist side of the story, not the structuralist one. It's a usual debate between Marx and Weber that was schools, though never actually mutually excluded each other. That's exactly the point. You always have to go in kind of a bipolar system that is dealing in themselves. But they're obsessed with the concept of tyranny, right? That it's just the evil guy at the top, and all the rest of the people is so candid and pure, right? And you can't think that, because we're not just violent, but we're kind of wicked on our own, right? Most of the times, we do have we do respond to certain mechanisms, but call them as you like, that are definitely not always pushing towards the direction of civilization. But that's exactly what violence actually helps to pressure you in that regard. And once again, if you had simply been passive or pacifists, at this point would have slaughtered each other quite easily, right? Because the evil guys would have taken over, would have been a mess. But we are humans, so we can't just be murderers, and also we can't just be pacifists. We are a middle way that made things work. There are other historical examples. It would surprise you, for example, what, I don't know, Gandhi's beliefs, or the whole idea of the Indian independence was about. If the Indians had guns, saying Gandhi would have actually agreed to use that, right? And I say this for one specific reason, that we think that we don't have to absolutize violence as a mean of resolution, because once again, this is what most of the times it's actually not. War doesn't happen, fortunately, every time there is a strife of some sort. It happens quite rarely, after all. But this is kind of a more of a strategical thought, is that you can objectively achieve something through passive resistance if that passive resistance, though, is like in the case of India, and that's why it's such a good example. It actually couldn't be stopped with violence. But just because India had that specific case, because not making those millions of Indian workers producing stuff would have made the system collapse, and would have grown inconvenient for the British. And this is exactly the point that von Clausewitz also deals with here when we call it war as a business, because war is not, once again, something on its own, but it's concluded into politics, once again. So politics, in many ways, is also something that actually kills much more than war does on a regular basis, and yet nobody cares. I mean, if we bomb one place, we kill 3,000 people, everybody goes nuts. We make die 100,000 Africans because we block the exports of dairy products. Nobody gives a damn. And where's the actual morality in such a belief, right? This is not to say, once again, this is not a generalization. It's simply saying that most people don't even get to this point when they make a political let's put it, they express a political opinion in such matters, because I don't know what is it with that, but this should be the single most important things to discuss. And yet we live in a time of war, right? We live in a time which we have seen from the beginning of the millennium actually a revival of warfare in some measure that is fortunately still very reduced, and the only reason being since the 1940s actually that there were that there are weapons of mass destruction around that froze our this violent outbreak. But why? Because that's a threat of violence in itself, right? It has a huge deterrence that is considerable as One, and what does trigger that thing to become from potential to action? Politics, only politics. You have to decide whether to launch an atomic weapon on someone else. And that doesn't happen by itself. And that's, by the way, what quite luckily, and also here not to be for granted, actually spared us from causing a nuclear holocaust during the Cold War, albeit we got pretty close to that, right? Look at Able Archer and how we actually made it to set the thing off, because if we had to just respond to a kind of a alleged evil that is always permanent in us, we would have simply annihilated each other. But fortunately, we're not ants that would, destroy the world in a few weeks had they nuclear weapons. And the general the moral spectrum of humanity is way more, let's say, more complicated and deeper, if you want, than the picture. We're just a bunch of brutes. We simply are here. We don't deserve it. No, actually not. And we have, on the contrary, huge potential to do a lot of good. And that's what that should push us to investigate these topics and sociological topics, as von Clausewitz puts it here. We're talking about social, like we're talking about society, right? And so studying history is actually a measure to understand that better, because history is effectively a enlarged and social history fundamentally. It's a form of sociology, if you want. And von Clausewitz says it is a conflict of great interest. They're talking about war, of course. War is a conflict of great interests, which is settled by bloodshed, and only in it that is different from others. This is what we just said when we were saying that politics actually can kill more than war, but it doesn't do it violently, right? At least it does it violently, but not a point of organizing itself in an actual war, as we could define it better. What does this mean? It means that, once again, if you let people smoke, getting lots of lung tumors, and that way that kill them actually, and that also weigh considerably on our sanitary systems, nobody cares. Of course, that is also kind of a bit more complicated than this, because there is not just there is paradoxically even a gain from that, right? There is someone else at least that makes money out of that. But in fact, is that so worse? Is that so better than actually killing someone with a surgical strike? Maybe by mistake. I mean, it's quite an unfortunate thing, but we're proportionally speaking, what are we talking about? Seriously, right? So war, in other terms, is just the mean, as we've seen, a violent one. That's it, literally. It's as if, on the bus there was someone stepping on an exit door and doesn't get out of the way. Where there are two ways of saying, politely, which probably is gonna not change anything. You can smash that person's face, and well, that person will remember it for the rest of his life. So maybe sometimes violence would be kind of more acceptable. The problem in that case is that would cause maybe potential outcomes that are damaging overall. Society is going to weigh on it, and that's also what we have to consider, sadly, and that's why we refrain from being violent, even in moments in which we could be easily, right? I think most of us would actually exercise violence much more than what we would do if there wasn't any deterrent here. And what we study, in fact, in history is exactly that today we live in a world in which the state has kind of an iron fist to make it stay pretty quiet, right? Even when actual injustice is happening to us, right? We're suffering from it. But first of all, society can't take it for such a long time. So there is a limit to that as well. And secondly, we probably, however, are always aware. I think I don't know about you, but I personally feel this very much, not just because incidentally I, ended up to dedicate my life to such topics, but also because I feel it, right? Think about money. Here, this paragraph is beautiful because von Clausewitz is saying it exactly right. It's a business. It's a matter of transaction, right? How much is a punch in the face worth? You can give an actual price to that, right? It sounds bad, but so it is. I mean, damn, even a human life on the market has a price, and I'm not kidding. And we should all know that, actually, living in the world in which we do. But why does life has a price? Because if you ask the single person and say, no, well, I will pay everything, right, it would pay much more. Yes, but this is not important because this is a social matter. And therefore, this means there are people who are giving a price to your life, which is entirely different, right? If your parent dies, you cry. If a neighbor dies, you will think about it, you'll be sad. If another person that you don't even know from the other side of the world dies, even in the most horrible way, you actually don't give a damn, and you must be honest about it. So, you see, life does have a price, sadly enough, but it has it because there is a social cost of it. It's not because of the individual person. There is not an absolute value in here. There is a group that is the one that is entitled of exercising collectively violence. And this is the problem, is that another aspect that we tend to overlook is that we don't just exercise violence against one another, right? It's not about, being, the chieftain of a tribe that decides to go, raid and pillage and rape another enemy tribe because, we are this tribe here, we are the better than the others. We're talking here about countries of tens, not of hundreds of millions of people who can actually deliver an amount of violence that is enough to wipe out the entire human race out of the face of the earth, right? And so the responsibility that lays behind it is dramatic, yet it is collective, and we know what are the challenges posed by collective decisions, right? There is an enormous problem about it, and this is very interesting because when you look at the strictly military decisions, you realize that there is a hierarchy. There is always some, but also, in civilian life, there is always someone at the top. We actually don't live in a direct democracy, and thank God we don't, because, who can negotiate in a direct democracy? We actually delegate someone to govern on the base of what our quite maybe badly posed expectations most of the times, but that eventually will take the decisions in our place, right? We're not literally responsible for everything the politicians we voted for actually do, because at one point they can go nuts or do things we wouldn't agree with compared to what we delegated them for. So the problem here is massive because it's a matter of a collective choice, right? And that's where it gets pretty serious, because if the majority decides something pretty bad, right? Think about National Socialism. National Socialism was, can't say fully democratically rising to power, but it was actually voted by the majority of its country. So this is what's the point there, right? That's why we established things like human rights. I mean, to determine the fact that democracy in this sense can fail into non-democracy, that there are certain inalienable rights that must be defended. This is much older than that, of course. It's a universalistic principle that dates back millennia in our civilization. And it's a really, really big problem, because the more our civilization is developed and more it requires a collective organization. And as a consequence, the margin for unpredictability of how this violent, collective violent power is going to be used is much more difficult to control. And if there is a lesson that history teaches us, is that the progress of civilization does not reduce the destructibility, right? The destructive power, let's put it better, of the same civilization. It's quite the contrary. When we're primitive tribesmen who like to scorch each other alive, we didn't have the potential to actually wipe out the entire human race. Together we do have, and also we went pretty close to do it, which is also the most terrifying thing. So this is an enormous ethical problem, and the fact that von Clausewitz here is so brilliantly pointing it out tells you how deep this person had realized. Consider von Clausewitz had just come out of literally the largest war and the largest destructions that history had ever seen at that point, right? So Napoleonic era was objectively that. So that was now how we have seen it all. We've seen World War I, we've seen World War II, right? But think about it from a man writing in the 1830s that had fought throughout all the Napoleonic era. That was an enormous deal and was particularly evident in front of him. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, it would be better, instead of comparing it with any art, always talking about war is the subject, to liken it to business competition, which is also a conflict of human interests and activities. So, business competition. This is a pretty damn good analogy, right? We are all competing in some way, and we're doing it in a way that is not just based on, like, smash a club on your skull. It's about, let's see what we can do in a system that is also pretty complicated to find, I don't know, allies and other resources, other means to get them. So it's really a merciless competition. Look at how the markets in the world fundamentally function. They can go out of hand. That is also an important aspect of the story. I mean, it's not a mechanical thing. You can also lose the plot and cause mass disasters, right? Think about World War I. I mean, that was a pretty bad miscalculation. We can't say, actually a pretty, I support the idea that World War I had a logic in itself, and that it was, in fact, the product of its politics and society, not necessarily in the monstrous, corrupted, evil way we whine about, thinking that we are somewhat morally superior to people who live in that point. No, we largely are not, necessarily at least. The thing is way more complicated in this specific example, but meaning that there is always, it's as if we, as a culture, I don't know in other countries, but in the West at least, we had given toward this basically different face and character from any other thing. No, it's literally normally just a business competition. I mean, it's like it. Let's be honest about it. I mean, it uses different means, but these are means. These are not the intentions of the people who moved that. And once again, just with the market, you can destroy millions of people's lives and get away with that sometimes. And this happens, right? So once again, what is bad here? It's really the intention. It's really the ethics behind it. It's not the mean in itself, right? And von Clausewitz goes on and says that war is still more like it's fine to liken it to business competition, but it's still more like state policy. This adds particular taste to the thing because we know of the Clausewitzian Trinity that is incidentally associated to these elements of probability, calculation, enmity, and it definitely has to do with the social element in the Trinity as well. So it says like state policy, which again on its part may be looked upon as a kind of business competition on a great scale, so that politics is essentially the same thing, because after all, what is a business competition, right? It's still a society that is taking those decisions. There is a base, there is a market, there are people will buy and sell, and there is someone who takes decision. So it's essentially the same thing as politics, society, and in this sense, war is seen as the meaning which you intervene in it, right? And sometimes it's literally the whole thing. I mean, because war is literally economy. Many times, fundamentally, whatever side life is economy. Let's be honest about it. We even give a price to life before, so that is all the more meaningful. But here, von Clausewitz uses these metaphors to stress, I would say, the transactional logic of war in itself, right? There is not a name that is absolute. There is not a, an achievement that you have to reach necessarily at all costs, or at least the object you have always changes, right? And here von Clausewitz is talking about war not just as war in itself, but war as an instrument proper. So this means that you have, in order to wage it, to calculate whether in fact you can go back and forth from it. Like if you can suspend the hostilities, for example, if you can continue that, always given that conflictuality always remains, because as we've seen, human race is violent in itself. So it has always this thing in the back of its mind, right? Talking about it. But it's quite important that we get used to the idea of politics and war as a great competition that has its own set of rules, right? Not of laws, but of rules that are generally followed, because it has to do with society, so of humans that organize themselves collectively, that operate in a certain fashion, that have certain hierarchies, that have certain group behaviors, right? So these are certain patterns that you can identify certain patterns in this dynamics that are incidentally also what von Clausewitz is trying to do with war in the Vom Kriege. Like, it's saying more or less basically what war works like, even if every single situation effectively changes, and therefore you have, with all your ethical responsibility, getting in charge of it, right? If you started, if you're directly responsible. Then von Clausewitz writes, besides, state policy is the womb in which war is developed, in which its outlines lie hidden in a rudimentary state, like the qualities of living creatures in their germs, right? This is very, very deep. It's like thinking at war as an embryo within politics. It is exactly what it is, right? It's this, if you want, it is a simplification of the system, right? It's important that here von Clausewitz says that war is as if it was politics itself, but in a rudimentary state of the same, but still within politics. That's why it looks like an embryo proper, and the reason being that definitely war is not the most most of the time it's not the most sophisticated answer you can give to a situation. Actually, it's much more likely, before you declare war, that there is a better way out of that, right? That's why war is just the speediest way, right? The quickest way you can deliver yourself from some certain problems, right? It is an option that has enormous risks, though, compared to other human activities. So, and there is a general mistake in human nature to kind of undervaluate all what is effectively too complicated to calculate properly. And we have seen here throughout all the last paragraphs how, constantly throughout all the Vom Kriege, of how, you know how you start a war, but you don't know how you end it fundamentally, because you don't know most of what this is gonna be like, right? Even if you have an overwhelming advantage, in proportion, the resources you have invested in here are often a bad gamble, right? It depends, right? If you can, it can be a bad gamble if it was just war from your side. If you had to solve an equation that is fundamentally not necessarily dominated by someone else is trying to solve at the same time. But from the other side, you have someone else. So that someone else will oppose to you during the war, but can do something extremely clever that will knock you out, maybe. But there are also maybe he does something particularly stupid you are able to exploit well and therefore obtain a great result. So you see in war that, in history that wars were, if you had asked, obviously to the people who had lost everything in it, family, house, and everything, they would say, well, this thing had nothing can ever repay me of that. We all know that. Look at refugees, look at people who escaped from real war, and you will never, their life is ruined forever in many ways. But this is valid also for veterans, for whoever goes to war and see what it really is. But quite cynically, if you had to measure this through the collective gain of it, well, you can't deny that the commitment in certain ways. I'm not talking about any specific war here, but looking just at history, that there were certain wars that opened to, but when won, happened to, even when lost, right? Think about, I don't know, Germany or Italy or Japan during World War II, right? That aside maybe for East Germany, that opened to a quite florid phase of their history, but as a defeat, right? Yeah, after the defeat. But what I'm saying here is that, I don't know, for Rome, for example, just banal example, the Second Punic War was something that they were pretty happy to have won, right? Not just because they objectively risked that point, and the Carthaginians were on the offensive, but other wars of expansion, say a normal war of expansion, well, it was fine for Rome to invade Greece, right? It was fine for Rome to invade Gaul, right? Maybe for the legionaries that did this, maybe their life was horrible and whatever, but Rome collectively earned from that. On the skins of other people, by the way. So, that's bad as it gets, but that's what the collective benefit is, what we were talking about, actually said, okay, yeah, this was fine. But it went well for us, right? Now, naturally, this is a quite bitter and sad realization, because today we would have, for example, from a moral point of view, a very different opinion on the story of, from the ancient world, where the objective of every polity was literally, conquering the entire world at the expenses of the defeated, right? But still, this is usually how polities behave, right? And therefore, if you look at this throughout all history as the universal dialect that every single people actually have always used, you realize that it is like a business. It's not the serious hieratic moment in which the wars began, right? The war always happens. Like, I don't know from which country you belong to, but wherever you come from, there's always one of your military men that is somewhere out in the world killing someone else. And this is normal, because this is how we do the thing. There's no other way we know as humans to interact at this specific moment, given this specific conditions. Let's say it better. Not that conditions can change, and this may change at one point. This is just an example about our times. But as we were saying about at the beginning of the video, even if we came at the point that we can live all peacefully, or relatively peacefully, well, another major problem occurs. Maybe we'll start killing each other once again. So don't give peace for granted. Don't think that you live, this is dedicated especially to people who, maybe of every age, but it seems like the very last, true last generations, maybe I'm slightly older to start acting like the old wise man, is realizing how what you have now is not to be given for granted, which seems banal to say, but I say this because it seems that we are insinuating this delusion that always is gonna everything is always going to do well, right? And no, you have to struggle for make things going well, in case you didn't notice. So you can't delude people into believing that essentially it's normal for humans to always live happily and free, because you will let them think that they're actually peaceful while they are not, because they can be easily triggered at the point they will not even know how to cope with that because they've never been educated about it. And those are the worst, right? There are many examples you can make even on, look at even age. Like there are certain, we are designed, evolutionarily speaking, to have a certain, to have a certain brain development, for example, during age that is at one point is even designed to make us go straight and to confrontate problems, because we realize that if we don't confront, if we don't hit the ground, if you don't really suffer about what life is, right? You can't learn anything good for being not just individually useful but collectively useful as well. So this is interesting because it's as if we need a conflict to grow old. We need to be conflictual and violent to grow wise and reasonable, right? This is what Athena symbolizes, for example, in the Hellenic mythology as such, right? Athena is the goddess of war and at the same time the goddess of wisdom and of political life, right? Why is this important? Because as you know, the Hellenic pantheon has Ares as well as a god of war, but Ares is simply truly the not necessarily the brute as such, but it's like the animal-like war. It's the warrior. Ares is the prototype of a tribal warrior. Athena is not. Athena is the prototype of the citizen soldier. You would think of, and she always beats the hell out of Ares in every single myth in which they fight. Guess why? Because she's civilized, because she's educated, because she has come from a society that is not more advanced because she thinks that civilization doesn't require violence, but because she perfectly knows, as the goddess of wisdom, that civilization always has violence and has actually to deal with it much more in terms of commitment of resources in proportion of the decisions and the consequences have to be taken than a tribal society that more or less does only that because it's basically the only thing they can do, and that's what their stage of development remains. And guess who wins all the time? Civilization. Athena always wins and Ares always loses. So it's that, and this is what the Greeks had understood back in the day already, and this is what we also came straight from in many ways as a Western civilization, and yet after 2,500 years we still don't know the ABC of political education in this regard, and we delude ourselves in thinking that there is an intrinsic evil in war, where war is just an instrument and a mere continuation of politics by other means. So what pulls the strings is the problem, or may be actually the solution as well, not war in itself. Right? Always realizing how terrible and devastating and dangerous it is, but how necessary it can be. Like World War II is always the best example in this regard, for which we have to be thankful that there was someone who took a rifle and came here to liberate us, right? Even if maybe they didn't give a damn about us, maybe they were forced, and maybe they were not truly convinced, but they did it anyway, and that's the real difference. They did it, and that is the difference between life and death. That's the difference that makes in reality. Wishful thinking doesn't resolve problems. Okay. So yeah, beautiful phrase, the last one. About the the embryo, right? This fact that state policy is the womb in which war is developed, in which its outlines lie hidden in a rudimentary state, like the qualities of living creatures in their germs. Because objectively, war is more savage in this regard, but it's still essentially a prototype of politics in itself, right? Even what happens on a battlefield is a sort of bargain, right? Even combat, even the fight is it's not an absolute violence. And this, we have seen it in the first book of the Vom Kriege, right? That there is nothing like two people that mutually destroy each other, not even on the field, right? There is always a side that is kind of less, is more reluctant, let's put it in this way, another one is proactive, more active, I mean, and they kind of balance the thing out, and they don't slaughter each other, right? There are effectively usually contained losses compared to the potential devastation that even just the weapons they use could deliver, right? So that's reality. And why? Because there is a human nature in it. War is not a machine that swallows everything. You need a will, an idea, a moral strength to achieve that, right? Not even World War II in its total destruction was actually what the Nazis had wished for the total war, right? At one point, people surrender, at least most of them, and things, evolve in a certain fashion, right? And humans, after all, do not reach that absolute by definition, but they also not even tend, they tend towards it, may tend towards it when they fight, but they don't reach not even a great length of what it gets to go to the absolute, right? Albeit everything can always get worse, and this is another thing that we have preciously learned from history. Anyhow, yeah, I don't know how devastating this video was, because it's heavy stuff, right? And we kind of jumped to this relatively quickly compared to the previous paragraphs, because here we really have a lot to think about when we observe these stuff, and these are powerful statements, and they must be understood, they must be sculpted in everybody's mind. It can't be just like a memento. Here, this work is mandatory if you really want to understand anything about the place where you live, whichever it is, right? And alright, so next time we will talk about okay, well, we'll see it. Anyhow, for today it's everything. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.